The four things we're going to hit on today, we'll just talk about the value of an iterative process as you go through the create phase or the building of your solution. So why do you iterate? What's the value of it? What are the steps in that iteration process? So we'll cover that. And we'll talk about whether you should customize or configure, or what are the pros and cons of each of those? What are the costs that are associated with making a customization of a solution? And we'll talk about conference room pilots. What are they? When should you use them? When should you not use them? What are some things you should be worried about as you do a conference room pilot? And then finally, we'll talk about some of the challenges that you face during the middle of a project, because all of the goodwill that happens usually during the sales process and the kickoff process has a tendency to go down as you get into the middle of the project, and it's how you work through those challenges that usually ends up to have a big impact on how successful your solution is and how people feel about how well the solution has been implemented as well too. So those are key things to be thinking about. Every project goes through these challenges too. So how you get ready for them and how you work through them is critical to your success. So we shared this proven process, and in the first session we talked about align and a little bit of the define stage and how you go through the sales process. And last time was really about the define phase as you're moving from you've bought the product, now how do you get ready for the kickoff meeting? So in today's chapter, we're basically going from the kickoff meeting through the code complete process, or until you're ready to start moving into user acceptance testing and the deployment phase. So that's what we're going to cover. We typically call that the create phase. So you'll hear me say create or build phase. Those would be the same things. And then next time we'll get into how do you get ready to go live. So I talked about on the first session about the processes that are in scope. So really what we're trying to do here now is implement these processes or build these processes out. So in each of these areas, you're going to dive deep into what exactly you do in each of these high-level process categories. So you've got these common solutions that are not something that we created at Stoneridge. These are just common business scenarios. So some of them may be in scope, some of them may not be, and then in this part of the business, part of the project, you really need to go deep on each of these areas. So you've got your acquire to retire, your fixed assets depreciation, managing the major investments that you've made in the business, the capital items you've made in the business. Financial plan to report is really your financial side of your business, doing GL, bank rec, doing your financial planning and analysis. Hire to retire is typically what you call more of the HR or the people-oriented function. Idea to product is more of the engineering process. So how do you go about creating a product? What goes into it? How do you figure out what the bill of materials are? Those types of things. Issue to resolution is typically what we call more of the customer service side of the business. Market to opportunity is how do you sell your product? So how do you actually go out and get people interested in your product? And then how do you move that into an opportunity phase? So that's kind of the front end of the funnel. Then plan to inventory is really about managing your inventory and making sure you've got a good plan for your materials, resource planning, demand forecasting, that kind of capability. Procure to pay is a pretty common thing you hear about in ERP projects, so that would be all on the vendor and the payable side of the business. Project to profit would be for those project-oriented organizations that are doing projects for clients. You've got your scheduling, you've got your accounting, you've got your costing of your projects, sometimes materials that apply to it, fees. Quote to cash, you'll hear about that very frequently, again, on any kind of ERP project. Schedule to produce is more of the manufacturing components of it. And then service call to profit is more of your field service solution. So when you think about like the Microsoft products and how they're labeled customer service and sales and field service, these are how they relate to the processes. And the thing about processes, they oftentimes span what you would consider a Microsoft product. So if you think about market to opportunity, That spans both the marketing capability and the sales capability in Microsoft Dynamics 365. Quote to cash can go all the way from sales, could sometimes start with marketing, go to sales, and then it goes through like sales order processing within the ERP solution, all the way to the AR capability, all the way to collecting that cash and getting paid. So some of these kind of go through multiple different what you would consider a product in the Microsoft space. And that's why it's really important to think about these in terms of the process and the workflow. And that's really what you're trying to get into in this part of the project. So we have this approach that we call a joint process design. And a joint process design is an iterative way to go through your business process and make sure you really understand it. So it starts first in the upper left there with gathering requirements, so analyzing the process. So as you go through each of these narrow process areas, you start to gather, how do you do this today, and how do you want to be doing it in the future? What are the things you have to have on the report that you send to your clients, the information that you send to your manufacturing team, the materials that you need, like what are those things? And making sure that they're identified. And then you can go and try to configure that in the system. You may have to do some construction if you have to build an integration or build a customization. And then you go back and look at it again and go, can we improve the process? So the joint process design is really an iterative approach that allows you to dig deeper and deeper and make changes as you go along. So that's really what we're trying to do here in this joint process design. It kind of comes from joint application design, but in a process-focused approach. So that's how we came up with the name for that, and it's something you want to iterate through. And if you think about like how you would lay this out in an implementation, you generally, again, last time we talked about sprints. So on the top, I've got sprint 1 through 11 here in this just kind of generic view of when you would do certain things in a project. And then I have JPD, which means joint process design 1, 2, or 3, followed by a CRP and a user acceptance testing or a UAT. So this is one way you could look at modeling out your project schedule based on making sure that you have time to dig in and go deeper on each of these areas. So you'll notice here in this schedule, like manage vendors, the second one there. In Sprint 2, you've got JPod 1, you've got JPod 2 then after it, and then you go into conference room pilot. So but if you look at EDI, you've got 4 rounds of JPods. So depending on the amount of customization, the amount of requirements that are needed, you may schedule a varying amount of joint process designs. The idea with joint process design, number one, is you want to dig in. So we'll come in, or your partner will come in and say, this is how it works out of the box. Tell us where we're wrong. That's really what joint process design is all about, because we want to focus you on using the out-of-the-box capabilities. And then we'll take lots of notes after that. And then joint process design number 2 will be, here's the system configured based on things you told us in joint process design 1. Does this work for you? And if the answer is still no, or there's clearly a customization that's needed, then you typically will go back through that in joint process design number 3. So the number of joint process design sessions you want to have is really dependent on how much an area is going to be customized or how complex that area is. So certain things like managing vendors may be less complex than if setting up an EDI. So we'll come back to this and talk more about it when we get into CRP. But the goal of this collaborative design approach is to be objective, is to demonstrate the processes and make sure that we're getting collaboration in the design. So if you're working with your partner and they're showing you the software and saying, tell me where I'm wrong on this, please speak up and say, hey, this is not working the way we expected, or that's not what we do here. You've got to make sure that you're bringing that up to make sure that the solution is going to work for you. Other goal is to just get in the software, get used to using it. The kind of waterfall approach that we used in SureStep back when I was at Microsoft was like, here's a whiteboard, tell us what you do here. And that leads to a lot more customizations because it's not focused on what the product actually does. So that's really what we're trying to do in the collaborative design approach and getting you in the software. And then it gives you some flexibility too. So if something does need to take a longer time and more detail, then you can dive deeper into those areas. The other thing I would say is if you have exceptions, and everybody does, think about how you bring up those exceptions and how frequently you do those exceptions. So bring them up, let's talk about them, but you may not want to necessarily build a system around a process that you do once a year that takes an hour in a spreadsheet, right? If that's going to take 60 hours of development time, it's probably not worth it. So identify the exceptions, try to understand how frequently those uncommon use cases come up, and then you'll have to decide if it's worth investing in that level of, in a solution for something that you rarely use. So the iterative sequence, as I mentioned, in JPod 1, it's really about showing the process groups, identifying what's all in scope, walking through the solution out of the box as Microsoft has provided that software, and then identifying where are the gaps. Like, does this work for you? Nope, I need this field on the vendor setup because it's a critical field for us. Okay, great. That's not in the software, so we're going to have to do a customization. Also, we want to try to get from you some like demo data as well too to show in JPod 1. In JPod 2, we start showing the process in a little bit more depth. So we'll try to show the happy path of how you do something. And then if that works for you, you can sign off on and say, that's approved, let's dive deeper into this more complex area. Also, that's a great time to talk about what alternate paths are, what new requirements you have, and that's generally when we start defining the gaps in more detail. Then a JPod 3 and or 4, again, now we're demonstrating the alternative paths that you've talked about in JPod 2. In those sessions, we're typically trying to use some of your actual data, and then that's when you will go into try to get approval for some of these more alternate paths or these uncommon situations. And then if JPod 3 doesn't cover it, you may have to do JPod 4 again to make sure that you've got all that covered. And then the next step of the iteration would be to do a conference room pilot where you actually go back through the whole process and make sure that it works as expected. So if you think about like a process flow for quote to cash, for example, there are a lot of steps in that process and a lot of different players may be involved with this process. So the first step might be creating a quote, then it might be how do you send that quote, how do you get confirmation from your client? Then once you've gotten confirmation, how do you get that product to them? You might have to pick it, you might have to ship it. What is the transportation cost associated with it? Then you'll create an invoice for it. Once the invoice is created, then you've got to receive that cash and make sure that that cash has been applied to that against that particular invoice for that customer. So there's a lot of steps involved, and as you go through the joint process design, you want to make sure you really inspect each of these steps to make sure that you've covered off on everything that you need to do. So if you think about like what is needed to have a successful joint process design session, key thing is you got to make sure your decision makers are in there. And those decision makers are typically going to be your business process owners and some subject matter experts. But ultimately, you need to know who is going to make the decision because you're very likely to change how you do things when you go through this. In fact, you really should consider this as an opportunity to change how you do things because the way you did it before may have been something you had to do based on the way that your system previously worked or system limitations that you had in the past. So you want to make sure that your decision makers are ready to be able to approve a change in how you do things. You want to raise those alternate paths. You want to think about different ways of doing it. You want to listen to your consultants as they say, this might be a way you can do this out of the box. Would that work for you? Now, that might mean more change to your current process today, but it could save you quite a bit of money in the implementation. You want to make sure you know who's doing what as you go through the process. So who is the one who sends out a quote to a client today? You know, what role within your company is doing that? Once that quote is approved, who do you hand that off to? And do you go create an order? Who creates the order? What's on the order that might be different than the quote? So making sure that you've got those roles defined and know who's doing what really helps with the process, and also how do you set up security and what roles you set up in the system based on that. And then the more you can provide artifacts or documents, here's an invoice template that we use today. Here's the information that customers really like to see on that. Or here's the here's the bill of lading that we send out today, and that's required by the state of Iowa. You know, those are the types of things that if you can bring to the joint process design session, that way that your consultants can make sure that we get an understanding of each of those areas and can check those boxes. So please bring that information as quickly as you can, include it in the SharePoint or Teams site to make sure that everyone can look back on it and make sure that we're checking that box. And then provide feedback. If you have concerns, bring them up. Once you've seen something that's going to work for you, give approval so that way we can keep moving to the next thing. There's always plenty of things to look at in here. So the quicker you can move through these items, the better off you're going to be. And then at the end of each session, make sure that you've got a good list of tasks that need to be completed, that you've got your team focused on, that you know who's going to take what action items, because there's always a lot of follow-up for these sessions as well too. So as we think about it, let's step back for a second and talk about what is a requirement and what is design as you're going through that process. So when I think about a requirement is not code, right? A requirement is what is the business process that you need to satisfy. So the requirement might be, I need to do a credit check when I create a new vendor, okay? That is a business need. Let's not think about what the system needs to do that first. That is just a requirement in your business process today. So typically your business analysts who are working on a project, or your consultant, or your core team members, we want to know what those requirements are. What are the things that you need the software to do? You also want to then, as you're going through that process, think about how do you want to test this? So like, what is an example that you've got of where you did a credit check when you created a new vendor or created a new customer, sorry. What is the time where you may have done something like that? What's an example so that you can test that as you get into the process? So those are requirements. Those are business needs that you need to solve. The design is then, how does the software accommodate that requirement? So the designs are often written up in something that's shortened to an FDD, but that is a functional design document. So that design document is written typically when there's a customization that needs to be built. So if the solution can handle it out of the box, the consultant will show you, here's the requirement and here's how it works in the software. And nothing needs to be changed. There might be configuration that needs to be done, but ultimately it is something that can be done within the solution. Design typically happens when it can't be done within the solution. So that's when you're going to go and write a design for, here's the process, here's the requirement, here's how we recommend that it get to be done in the solution. And then they'll work with a developer to figure out, is there a table that needs to be changed? What code needs to be written to do that? And that's typically going to be done by a functional consultant. And then the developer will work with them to make sure that it makes sense. So when do you customize versus configure? So configuration is using the capability in the software to be able to set it up in a way to allow you to perform a function. So there's kind of a couple different types of configuration. There's parameters, and parameters will be flags that you flip within the software that tell you whether or not a certain feature maybe is turned on or a different way of doing something. So those are parameters that can be configured. But then there's also like master data configuration. And master data configuration would be like setting your terms of payment. Do we want to have a net 30 and net 10 or 2% in 10 days type of payment term? Those are things you can configure within the system. So that's what a configuration is, which does not require custom code to be able to do something. Customization is very different. A customization is when you're, and there's kind of two types of that too. There's a personalization, which you might hear about, and personalization is something you can do within the software where you can create, as a user, you can create your own view to a particular grid, for example. So I want to see on the vendor, I want to see whether or not they've been, approved or not. And that view doesn't come out of the box, but I can actually personalize my system to add that without creating any custom code. Whereas a customization is generally where we're going to build you a brand new grid that doesn't exist within the solution, where you have to pull the data together from multiple different tables to make that work. That would be a customization. So when do you customize versus when do you configure versus customize? If at all possible, you want to choose configuration, because as I said, that's not changing the code within the software. That's just taking advantage of the capability that's in there today. When do you need a customization? So you need a customization in a few different times. One is when the system lacks functionality in the area that you need. So if you have a requirement, it can't be met by the system, that's when you explore customization. You often need a customization when you're integrating with another system. Again, you want to try to use tools that are configurable for integrations, but you can't always do that. Reports often need to be customized as well too. So if you can't do that within the user interface of the system, you might need to do that. And the other thing I think about when it comes to customization, like if you have a process today where you're doing it a little bit differently today, so let's say the way you're paying vendors is different than the way it works out of the box in the software. That might not be something that you want to customize. You might want to look at that as an opportunity to change your process to the standard way it's done within Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, for example. But if you have something that is your secret sauce or something that makes you distinctive, you want to make sure that you've got that represented in the system, and that's a good time to customize something. You don't want to customize it when, again, it's a standard process, but or you could use a standard process, but you don't because it's always been done that way. And then you also want to consider, are there ISVs that might fill the gap that you might want to do, like the leverage solution that we built for the agriculture space. Yeah, you could customize the solution to do splits, but you would not want to do that because that was very, very complex to build, and leverage has that functionality. So in that case, you would choose to use the leverage ISV solution rather than customize that yourself. Another option is if you can use Power Apps, Power BI, depending on if it's a report or if it's a function. Those are great solutions that you can use to be able to get data in the system where you might not have to do as much customization as you otherwise would need to do. Because the reason why you don't want to do customizations is because they cost a lot. And every time we talk to clients about customization, they're always appalled about the overall cost of it. And I'm like, well, you're not even seeing the full part of the customization. Because if you think about it, there's really three things that you're paying for here. First off is the original development. So first you've got your time to understand the requirements. Then you've got to build the functional design document, which takes time and takes back and forth to make sure it's right. Then you've got to go develop it. Then once you've developed it, you've got to write custom tests for it, and you've got to test that solution. Then you've got to write documentation about how that works, and then you've got to train your users on how to do it. So if you think about like a standard way that Dynamics 365 Sales does, opportunity management, well, you can go watch a video on Microsoft's site about how to do that. But if you've customized it now to your own way, now you have to build your own video or your own training mechanism. So when the original development comes up, all of these aspects need to go into it. So sometimes you'll see something that's a pretty minor customization, and you might get something back like, well, that'll be 40 hours. And you're like, well, I thought that was minor. Well, again, it's taking into account the amount of time it takes to design it, develop it, test it, do documentation and training for it. And then once you're done with the original development, you've got to be thinking about time for regression testing. So once you've built that customization, now as you update your dynamic solution in the future, you're going to have to update it at least twice a year. So do you need to test that customization every, twice a year when you take those updates? Well, depending on how big of a deal it is, how important that is to your business, you probably should. So now not only are you spending money to write it in the beginning, but you're also now spending money to test it in the future. So again, customizations are a lot more expensive than people think. That's why you should try to avoid them the best you can. Try to use configurations if at all possible. And again, if you're thinking about a process that you do once a year that takes you maybe 8 hours to do, and you go, wow, that's 8 hours I'd love to get back. Well, that customization that to replace that might be 16 hours to do in the beginning, but then you've still got regressions in the testing of it in the future. So the overall cost of that might make that not worth doing. So you've got to really challenge yourself when it comes to, do I want to customize? Do I want to do this customization or not? All right, now let's switch gears and talk about the conference room pilot. So what is a conference room pilot? You'll also hear us use the word business simulation testing as well too. So if you hear our team use the business simulation testing, it's a similar thing to a conference room pilot. It's a little bit more clear in the naming of it. So what it is where you've got users in a room walking through the process with their hands on the keyboard, doing the functions. It's also a chance for the subject matter experts to get more comfortable in the system, because in the joint process design, it's mostly the consultants showing how it's going to work. In conference room pilot, it's users actually using the system. That's why they call it pilot. It's a great chance to get usability feedback to make sure that the process makes sense, because if you watch people go through it and they really struggle or something is out of order into how they do something normally, that's a great chance to update the process to reflect that. It gives you a chance to have your project leaders, your business process owners walk the team through the system and explain why it works. So it's a great opportunity for that. So what a conference room pilot isn't, sometimes you hear about it in a sales like proof of concept. That's not what we're talking about here. It isn't testing a fully complete system either. So the solution is not fully complete when you get to conference room pilot, and that leads to actually a lot of frustration and concern. So when you get to this stage and somebody starts using the system and they see that something is there, that something's not there that they need to see, they have a tendency to freak out about it. And so you really have to be clear on the expectations of what's in and what's not in the system at the time. It could very well be that the thing that they're missing is just not done, it hasn't been coded yet, or the code isn't finished, so it's not in the system at the time. If you tell them that up front, then they'll be fine with it. If you don't tell them that, they discover that, they're like, what's going on? Like, this system sucks, it doesn't work the way I expected it. So that's a real problem with conference room pilots. It isn't something for the partner to demo. Again, this is your users at the customer site, leading the process and working on the solution in the system. And again, please don't panic if something's not perfect. It's intended to be your first view of the solution to make sure that we're on the right track in terms of how it's getting done. And oftentimes you'll do a couple rounds of conference room pilots to make sure that the team is really comfortable with it. So again, setting expectations going into conference room pilots is really important because it's not a finished product at the time that you go into that. If everybody knows that and said, hey, it's your first chance to get your hands on the keyboard, see what you think, tell us what's wrong, tell us what might be missing, and then we'll work on it and we'll make sure it's good by the time we get it ready for a broader set of users to use the system. So going back to my schedule here, your conference room pilots may be at different times. So sometimes, depending on the number of processes you have in scope, you'll do a group of conference room pilots at the same time. Sometimes you'll do them at different times. But again, they're going to come after your round of joint process designs. But as you can clearly see here, they come before user acceptance testing. And conference room pilots are generally for your business process owners, your power users, or your more advanced subject matter experts, right? If you've got someone who is really anti-change, you might not want to put them in the conference room pilot because they'll be your loudest critic of anything that goes wrong in the system, and they may walk away thinking it's not a very good system. So just be cautious about that. You don't have to do conference room pilots, but you really, really should. It gives you a chance to practice the process end to end before the code's complete, so you can make sure that you have everything in there that's going to lead to a better solution. It helps with usability, can really save time and frustration, and it's intended to raise the confidence of the team that the solution is getting ready for deployment. But again, that can be challenging based on the expectations that you set going into it. So conference room pilot, usually it comes at the end of the build phase or the create phase. And this is honestly a lot of times where the project will be in its most tense moments. So I put this together and included it in the book, but if you think about the enthusiasm level as you go through a project, it always starts out really high. The kickoff meeting's great, everyone's excited about it, they know what we're building, they know who's going to be doing what, everyone feels really good about it. As the project goes on, that enthusiasm starts to wane. And the reasons are many. It could be that somebody didn't get a feature that they wanted, or boy, digging in, I've got more work than I needed, that I thought I was going to have to do. It could be that there's turnover at the customer or the partner, or I mean, there's any number of reasons why that enthusiasm level can go down. And it typically hits its low point, which I call the pit of despair, somewhere around the conference room pilot in the design phase. That's when people start to hear, you're not going to get the feature that you wanted. That has a tendency to make people pretty upset, or we're going to be over budget because the number of customizations that you've decided on is higher than what we recommended or what was originally envisioned. So during this time, it's really important that you set a proper path, because when you get to go live, the enthusiasm level can go anywhere from pretty high again, people are excited about what they got, to kind of in the middle, to, it could be kind of bad. So making sure that you can work through these mid-project challenges is always one of the hardest things to deal with and to get ahead of as you go into a project. So what are some of these project challenges? So it's basically people fearing the unknown, right? Where there is something not clear that is happening within the project. Trust is eroded, the schedule's not updated, somebody's leaving the project, constant change requests, the project's trending behind, people aren't having the meetings that they want to have, people are just burned out with all the work they've had to do, data migrations, running into a whole bunch of data issues, the project team's not making decisions. These are all common things that happen on a particular project. So how do you work through them all? Obviously, you want to work through them as soon as you can, but as you get to the middle part of the project, thinking about how do you get people's enthusiasm back for the project. And one way to manage this well is to use a risk register. So this is a project management tool that you should be using throughout the project. So you identify the risk, you identify the likelihood from a scale of 1 to 5. How likely is that risk to actually happen? And then you identify the impact from a scale of 1 to 5. Is what is the impact if that does end up happening? So something with a low likelihood and low impact, you're not as worried about. Something with a high likelihood, high impact should be something you're thinking about all the time. And then you just multiply those numbers together, and if it's 10 or higher, it should be something that you're worried about. And then you identify owners of each of those risks, and then what are things that you can do to mitigate that risk. So again, this is just a sample of some potential ideas, some potential risks that might exist on your project. But if you manage this throughout the project, you can try to stay ahead of these risks actually turning into issues. So just as we think about this side of the business of the implementation, I just want to do a quick reality check. So all projects are going to face challenges. If you think you can go through an ERP solution or a CRM solution and you're not going to have any challenges, you're wrong. It's going to happen every time. So the question is, how do you plan for it and how do you work through it once those come up? And that pit of despair typically happens at the end of the create phase. So if you know that going in, you can be ready for it. It's really key to build a trusting relationship with your partner. So whoever you're working with, the better you can establish that trust in the beginning of the project is going to lead to a much better outcome when you get to that pit of despair. And then just remember too that there's a lot of unknowns happening throughout the project, and there's this, overworked versus overstressed. And sometimes people are overworked because they have a lot to do, but honestly, if they know what they're doing and they tend to not be as stressed. Overstressed comes from being afraid of not knowing what is around the corner. So the more you can try to outline what's going to happen, outline what's expected of people, the better results you're going to get, because then even if they're overworked, they know what they need to do and they can get that done. Where the real problem comes into is when you bring in a lot of stress because they don't know what's going on. They're afraid of the unknown. That's when big challenges tend to happen.